This is a production of Cornell University.
Yeah, get us started, Frank. It's episode 11. It goes fast. Episode 11 of the Turf Show this year in our fourth season.
So we're more than halfway.
Yeah.
More than halfway. Okay, so a great a morning shot from Jim Pavinetti at oh gosh, right
Fairview?
next to the airport.
Fairview?
Fairview. Sorry, that's right. I was gonna say Fairway, and it's like Fairview, right? And Jim's done a great bunch of work on the golf course, a lot of renovation stuff, really talks about the BMPs that they've included in this. So always like sharing an early morning picture. But, today, Carla, we're going to get talking about some things we don't always talk about. And a lot of it was spurred by last week. Some of the things Rich Buckley said to us about what's going on early season. Now, I know this isn't a good picture. I took it off of Equipment Technician's Twitter feed. And this is a bunch of pieces of paper that you use to check sharpness on the mower with a magnet on it. So you can stick it in different places when you're working, so that you're not trying to pull it out of your pocket or grab it from somewhere else. This is, a little simple equipment technician hack, because really, we don't talk about this a lot, but these are really important people on golf courses, right? I mean, I actually think if you put superintendents, on the hot seat once in a while and say, hey, who do you want, an assistant or a good equipment manager? I think they'd probably take, not that anything against good, solid assistants, but setting a reel and setting these units up is so important to the overall performance of the golf course. Now, Rich said to us last week that early season anthracnose is picking up. Now, this only has one cause, that we are stressing these plants. They went into the winter stressed, and they're coming out of the winter stressed. And remember early on, Carl, we said there wasn't any winter, which means a lot of places have had a lot of play. And the combination of early season play, some already stressed grass is probably setting you up for, if you're getting it now, it's going to be a long season, because, I've been barking that, gosh, if your things don't look good now, the conditions are ideal in some ways, unless you're under a lot of stress. Now, thinking about anthracnose and mowing, thinking about anthracnose and traffic, the research is pretty clear that top dressing to protect the crowns of annual bluegrass is really critical. John Inguigiato's work, there's been some follow-up work on amounts of sand and timing of sand and spring timing of sand growth, of sand, to really get in there and protect that canopy is really critical, right? If you're getting out of the gate, now with some rain coming, you're a little bit soft, right? You got the mower set, maybe a little aggressive because there's a lot of grass there and you want to get it off. Once you start doing that, you better have some sand there to protect those crowns and prevent anthracnose, right? Because again, anthracnose is one of those diseases that, starts foliar, and then if stress continues, it will become, basal rot. And then once you rot the crown, you're done. You're just going to sit there and watch it look bad for a while, because the plant has no ability to regenerate tissue. And since we're talking about mowing, Brian Whitlark and John Daniels wrote a paper in the USGA Green section a number of years ago that talked about the bed knife position on a mower behind the center line of the reel. As soon as you start to move that bed knife position back, now sometimes that happens because you grind your reel so much, the diameter of the reel starts to shrink. When that happens, the only way to get the geometry in the reel to work right is to bring the bed knife angle up and back. So you're moving it back, which is allowing the reel to tip into the canopy, right, more aggressively and do some raking. So you see here, in this particular thing, we're at the same height of cut, but the behind center distance in one of the pictures brings you closer into the canopy. You're getting actually below the mowing height depth, because the reel is getting into the canopy and raking it out. So the further the bed knife is back in the reel, the more that reel is pitched into the canopy, the more it's slapping and whacking that tissue and adding to some stress and even cutting a little bit lower. Now, mower manufacturers set these things out of the shop different. I would check them when you get them. Not that everybody's getting a bunch of new mowers these days. They can't get them built, but when they can get them built, this is one area where the John Deere putting green mowers have the ability to get that bed knife closer to the center distance. It comes not as far behind the center distance. It gives you a little bit more flexibility. Now, what is the value of this? Again, we've talked about this before. When you get behind too far, the more aggressive bed knife angle that tips behind, you're tipping into the canopy more, which means you're adding more stress. We've played around with this many years ago. I think I've done this work. I think some of this work is 15, 16 years old now, where we set 5 mowers up, Flex 21s with the bed knife at different positions. Now, it took us a while in upstate New York to get anthracnose, but when we did finally get an anthracnose outbreak, we saw a very linear response in August and September, that when it was dry and it was still warm back in these years, and we had the more aggressive setting, we were getting more anthracnose the more aggressive the mower was set up. And we did this all year on an annual bluegrass bentgrass surface. Now, John Sorokin, Tom Nicolai, Aaron Hathaway, many years ago with Corey Yurcik at Michigan State, took this work we started and went a little bit further, looking at behind center distance, the impact on clipping collection and sand collection. So in very simple terms, the further back your bed knife is, the more sand you're going to pick up. So if we're telling you to top dress, right, and we're telling you that's going to help you with anthracnose, but your bed knife is too far behind the center distance, you're going to be harvesting more sand. So this is, again, where some people pivot to a John Deere machine. Other people go and change the bed knife behind center distance. Now, what's interesting here is green speed didn't change and clipping yield didn't change. So if you think you're being more aggressive to get faster greens, or you think you're being more aggressive to get more clippings and make faster greens, the research does not bear out that's what's happening. So listen, Carl, this has been an early start and talk to benchmarking our mowers. But I know you've got the bench heights and the things we set on the bench. You've got another look at benchmarking that is really interesting, looking at the operation as a whole and some of our successes in our state park program. Take it away.
Yeah, I think, Frank, it makes a whole lot of sense with mower setups when you can put specific numbers to behind center distance. That stuff with John Daniels, the USGA one, said, it's a 26% difference in height of cut. So I could say, oh, okay, if I was setting it at 125, but my behind center distance was way off, I was actually cutting at 0.093. So that was some of the calculations I was doing, like, hey, I thought I was cutting at 125. Oh my God, I'm under 100. It's really good to have that benchmarking stuff and those actual numbers to compare. Okay, heck, now I can measure behind center distance on my reels. How do I compare, right? With some of our agronomic practices, I think we lack some of that data. Right. So the idea behind benchmarking is really just having some way to evaluate or check ourselves relative to some industry standard. And so I show data last week on John Rahm and these PGA Tour guys. You hear strokes gained talked about all the time. That's their benchmarking tool, right? I know John Rahm is 2.4 strokes better than the average tour pro, right? That's how he's so good. And he gets there by being X strokes better per round in approach or driving and putting. But that's their benchmarking standard. Some of the benchmarking things we have, maybe we don't have quite as much data for that in some of our agronomic practices. Doug Lindy has worked a lot down in Delaware, trying to benchmark golf course practices and maybe some of their resources that they have available to produce playing conditions. This is some data from back in New Zealand when he was doing this in the early 2000s. Basically went around a bunch of golf courses. He asked them, hey, what's your revenue? How big is your green staff? What's your cutting height? And then he surveyed sort of just weed populations in the fairways. And not surprisingly, the courses that have higher revenue have higher green staff. They have lower cutting heights, right? Because they can maintain that and they have less weeds. And so when I look at this as a golf course, maybe where I'm looking at and trying to find usefulness is where do I fit in, right? Where's my sort of bin, you know? And when we think about labor is a huge deal, having the necessary labor to produce playing conditions. You know, I was finding some of this data from the GCSAA from last year's capital budget and labor survey. Okay, what's the general full-time FTE equivalents in the high seasons? If you have 1 to 5 FTEs in high season, you're actually in the bottom quartile of golf courses in the US, right? So that's good to know, right? And if you're golf course manager, your GM, your greens committees are expecting really high conditions, and you're sort of in the bottom half or bottom quartile of labor, hey, maybe that's one thing you can use to say, okay, I actually need 2 more people. I need 11 to be in that top 30%, and that might get us around to cutting fairways more often, keeping up with the rough, being able to top dress every 2 weeks to get out of Anfracto. So you just mentioned that, right, Frank? So we've tried to do some of this with our state parks and maybe some non-traditional metrics, pesticide use and pesticide risk. I know that's maybe sort of a taboo term, saying the term pesticide risk, but that's what we do with our state park courses. We work with about 15 for over a decade now. And what we've done is we have a state average for those watching. The black line is the state average of all those 15 courses. This is measured using the EIQ. We've got different regions, right? We've got courses in Long Island, that's the yellow bar up top, upstate in blue, you know, Hudson Valley, Albany in gray. What we've looked at over the years is, hey, which courses use more, right? Okay, Long Island courses, especially back in the mid sort of 20 teens, used a lot more pesticides. And it's not about like, hey, you got to use less. It's okay, why is that the case? It's probably extended growing seasons, right? They have a longer growing season. They have higher pest pressure. We've measured this now through some of our disease models on the forecast website. There's also quality expectations, right? So Bethpage State Park has high expectations, Montauk Downs, right? The golfers down there expect a little bit more. That drives resource use up. So it's understanding here's why you're above average. And similarly with upstate courses, hey, here's why you're below average. And you see actually over the years, we're sort of seeing all those regions sort of come together a little bit more in the data, especially the last 5 or 6 years. And a lot of that is from them figuring out, okay, here's where I can reduce, and hey, I'm still getting the quality. And now we've got data, Frank, from some courses across the nation. We've got an average now that we look at, you know, 260 in this metric. Not that means anything to anybody, but 260 is the national average. Our state park courses are under 100 on average. So that's good to say, hey, we've worked with them a lot on pesticide risk and trying to reduce that. And hey, it's good to know that we're below the national averages. And so we do this with fertilizer use as well. So we can look at the GCSAA data again is a good way to benchmark some resource use on golf courses. We got the Northeast courses from that recent data on the left, our state park courses on the right, we use less fertilizer. The goal is not to use way less than them. It's just to sort of figure out, hey, here's where we're in the ballpark. Okay, we're half a pound less on fairways. And our goal is actually to figure out what's the least we can do while maintaining those playing conditions. And what we've seen the last couple of years with increased traffic, especially on tees and fairways, is, hey, maybe we're pushing the bottom level of that. And maybe we actually need to come back up and get closer to those regional averages, right? And there's probably a reason why they're regional averages, is they probably work pretty good.
Yeah, right.
So using that as sort of context, and that's why I put this quote up on the screen, context is clarity. Sort of figuring out, you know, when you can have these benchmarking numbers, I think is nice to sort of get the lay of the land, right? I've had a picture of the land at Dinsmore, which is a really cool old golf course down in Hudson Valley. And the idea is not necessarily to be the best, right? I mentioned John Rahm and PGA Tour guys, they're trying to be the best in the world. With golf courses, right, you're not resourced to be the best for every golf course, and you're really just trying to figure out where you fit in, right? It's about fitting in. And again, with our state park work, we try and figure out, hey, where do we fit in the local golf community? So this is when we pull data from our friends at Pellucid, right? We look at the facilities that are around each golf course. Here's some data from Shenango Valley. So rural upstate New York. And when we look at the courses around them, they tend to be stratified in the what we call public medium, public low price points, right? So a lot of the golfers in that area, you know, they're not demanding high-end public golf. They're just demanding affordable golf. And that gives us some information about how we want to maintain the property. Hey, maybe they don't need perfectly manicured fairways. They don't need to have the rough fertilized. They just care about the greens, right? So it gives us some information on how we want to manage. And then you go to a place like Bethpage, right? And 65% of the courses within, I think this is 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers of Bethpage, they're private, right? So you're going to have a higher end audience. They're expecting, well manicured fairways, tightly mowed, right? 100% turf quality, real dense, nice ball lie. So trying to figure out benchmarking, not only in our resource use, but hey, what do our golfers expect from us? And trying to work backwards from that. So I talked about this with Mike Fidonza a couple of weeks ago, sort of measuring these outcomes. That's why I like benchmarking, Frank. It gives you that sort of that bar that you can be around. Okay, can I be a little bit below? Can I be a little bit above? I think that's really useful and can help drive decision making.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, Carl, everybody's heard, especially as long as we've been doing the show, right? We started it during COVID, and so we lost a lot of labor. I mean, we weren't sure we could work. When I look back at some of those talks, we didn't know if we could work. A lot of people said, "Wow, I'm actually getting a lot done without golfers here," or "Wow, I'm actually getting. I didn't do that, and it doesn't seem to matter." Right. And I think sometimes we internalize, I got to do more with less. Right. And the reality is, I think to your point about the bottoming out maybe of the nitrogen, when I see that 58% of the golf courses in America have less than 10 people full time at peak season, that means we're already, I think, operating at a pretty high efficiency. If you just go to less than 15, you've got 3/4 of the golf courses in America have less than 15 people at full season. Now, a full season in the desert and the South is different than, full, peak season in the North. But I think, Carl, this is a very interesting, number one, piece of data to look at labor. Because as you said, if I got more guys, that means I got more hands for weed whackers around the trees. I can rake the bunkers 3 times a week versus once a week. And I think really good golf course superintendents do talk to the people about these kinds of things. And even one step better, when you get into corporate golf and you go to Troon or you go to Kemper Properties, they got this dialed in. They don't spend a dime more than they have to relative to the results they're going to get, the return on that investment, right? With a higher round of golf, paying more for a round of golf, right? Dynamic pricing. When the demand goes up, you got a nice place, you're getting more money, you better have the resources. And my sense is those places are not afraid to spend that money, Carl, and it seems to pay off in the markets they're in. Anything you want to wrap up here, since I added some color, ready to move on?
I'll just comment, Frank, that those bigger organizations, because they're looking at the bottom line a lot more, they have that information on, hey, if we buy another pallet of X, what does that get us in return on investment, right? And I think probably a lot of the individual courses that are privately owned or owned by a group of members maybe don't look at that quite enough. And that's like 101 running businesses, right? Big corporations, right. That's what they're doing, right? So just a comment that I think that sort of standardized data is probably important to have.
Okay, well, speaking of benchmarking, let's look at where the temperatures were last week. And it was a cooler week, right? After 20 degrees above normal, like I said, normal or a little bit below normal is going to feel cold. And in fact, it really did. And essentially, we've hit a bit of a stall here in many parts of the Northeast from a temperature perspective. We were talking about it on the conference call this morning, and it has this weird feeling to it, the growing season. The numbers say we're ahead, even collecting since March 15th, not grabbing that heat at the end of February or much of the warm winter. We're saying since March 15th, we're close to 2 weeks ahead, at least a week to 2 weeks ahead. And you see it in the forsythias, they're done in many areas in upstate New York. And I'm not seeing crabgrass anywhere. We're going to chat with Matt Elmore tomorrow on the grounds episode of the Turf Show and talk, of course, more in depth about that. Now, it was actually relatively good rainfall wise. Just about everybody got a half an inch. A lot of people got an inch or more, and a bunch of people got 3 and 4 inches through the Connecticut Valley, out by Storrs, Connecticut, tons of rain. But then as you get out to the east end, out to the Cape and the islands out there, Long Island, much less rainfall, less than a half an inch in those areas. But overall, we're expecting more rainfall coming and some cooler temperatures. So cooler temperatures, below normal temperatures, right? Instead of being in the mid 50s, we're going to be in the low 50s to upper 40s. And rainfall is going to come through again. Friday, Saturday looks like a big hit. And then it's sort of cloudy and rainy for the next week. I think Art described it as, good weather for a duck moving forward. Now, one of the things we have heard about is another one of these early spring diseases. And this is where we're getting all screwed up. It's like, man, I think I'm ahead, but whoa, I got pink snow mold. I think I'm ahead. Oh, I got whitea patch. Oh, I think I'm ahead. I got early season anthracnose. These sorts of problems really start to wreak havoc and make you question some of the things that you're doing. There's a lot of products available for whitea patch. This is a Rhizoctonia organism. So anything that works well on the rhizox is pretty good. I will put a plug in for Polyoxin D, which is Affirm or Endorse. That's a really good rhizoc product. It actually has that sort of niche area. So if you have a yellow patch, if the conditions are going to be conducive, this typically is considered a cosmetic problem, but if conditions persist, you will get pitting and depressions in the rings from this organism. So again, early season problems that we don't often worry about because we think we're going to get growth on the other side. Looks like those problems are getting worse. Rainfall comes. I wanted to put, even though I got some crappy pictures here, I saw some collar dam work going on. A lot of times collars start to build up in their height and get higher, build up either the green, they're getting top dressed differently. They're getting not rolled as much. And you get these collar dams in certain places that hold water on a green. And especially if it's in a low spot on a green, this adds to a lot of problems. So getting in there, sod cutting, taking it out, a good simple thing to help your cleanup passes survive the growing season ahead is getting the water off of there. Now, the soil temperatures, we were talking 50s and 60s last week, and now we're talking, in the Adirondacks in the 30s, but in the 40s through much of the region, and even just the 50s are confined to just along the coast and further south by Virginia. When you got to go to Virginia now to get 55 degrees at 2 inches. So again, if you were running out there early because you saw the warm temperatures and you made your applications early, you're going to sit there and stare at that for a couple of weeks. And that might be a wasted herbicide or fertilizer application with the conditions we're under right now. So let's get back to the anthracnose thing, because once we start talking about growth, now we're talking about the inability to keep up with the traffic and stuff that you're doing. Last week, we talked about stress, Carl, and we said, hey, stress your plants. You can dry them out a little bit. And I think you and I were corrected pretty quickly by Dr. Buckley, who said, whoa, that's assuming you got plants that can do those things. So when you start thinking about intentionally imposing stress on your playing surfaces, there are, of course, enormous numbers of benefits you get from the variety of ways we can impose stress, from mowing lower and verticutting and rolling to moisture stress like we talked about last week. Now, when we think about imposing stress on annual bluegrass, which is just getting going now, right, we know that it's coming into that time where seed head production is going to be at peak. Now, when that happens, a lot of the resources that plant used to use for vegetative growth and root growth stops. So, that plant is triggered now to produce that flowering stalk. That is the end. As soon as that plant produces that flowering stalk and you mow it off, that tiller is dead. So you get this natural waning period on the other side of a seed head flush that I think we got to be careful on putting the stress on. The other thing I'm starting to see, just like we predicted, is a lot of overregulation, right? If you're not tracking your growth and you're saying, wow, it's the end of April, it was just warm, I'm getting buckets like crazy, let me go out with my Proxy Primo, boy, it seems like it's growing, let me get the rate up, boom, and now you're overregulated because it's cold. You're overregulated because you got too much traffic. So you're just not able to grow. So let's remind everybody the great work that our colleagues at Rutgers have done in elucidating the impact of a variety of practices on basal rot anthracnose. And what they concluded clearly was you can mow low, you can roll, you can get fast greens, but you better feed those things. because as soon as you start skipping on nitrogen, the amount of basal rot anthracnose that you see in that stand goes up exponentially in some cases. You really start to see that surge when growth rate is dropping off. So nitrogen at this time, if it will respond to it, will certainly give you some benefits. Now, you got to remember, if we're averaging temperatures 55 degrees, the cool season grass growth potential is only at 40%. So you're not even operating at full vibration yet in your plants growing, and you're beating the hell out of them, and you're top dressing them, and you're playing golf on them like crazy, and the temperature's not on your side, and you got overregulation, and you got traffic, and you're wondering why we got some of these early season problems. Let's just remind everybody that when we say low nitrogen, we mean, below 3 pounds of N. Once you get from 3 to 6 pounds, we call that high nitrogen, but it's not high nitrogen for the actual growth of a grass plant. You can put up to 16 pounds of N per thousand per year before you max out clipping production. So we are purposely keeping these plants in a nitrogen starved condition, right? Nitrogen is not as prevalent in the environment other than in the atmosphere. So to plants, it's a limiting nutrient. So we have been taught to limit this nutrient, but we've also been taught that we don't want to get, too out of whack here because it leads to anthracnose. Now, the other thing we've learned about growth rate is the higher you mow, the slower it grows. Putting greens grow more rapidly than collars that are a little bit higher and right next door. And so consequently, growth regulators applied at the same rates and frequencies over these two surfaces will over-regulate the collars. And then guess what else we do to the collars? We turn the mowers on the collars. I don't care how many flat pieces of fence you put there, you're still putting traffic and wear and tear in those things. So growth rate is really impacted now. Now, I dug this up from 40 years ago. Clark Drossel's been retired now for a number of years. When he did his PhD at Penn State in 1981, he looked at the effect of cutting height and nitrogen rate on green speed, on ball roll distance. He mowed it 1/10 of an inch and 3/16, or 187 thousandths of an inch, right? And he went from 1 pound of N to 6 pounds of N. He got a green speed at 1/10 of an inch at 2 pounds of N that was a little bit right at 10 feet. When he went up to 6 pounds of N, that green speed only went down 6 inches. Now, we're not doing the same things we did 40 years ago, but we're trying to make the point that if you're struggling with a lot of these things that are impacted by low growth rate, don't be afraid to add some nitrogen in small amounts. You don't want to add like, a 1/2 pound of granular, but maybe 1/10 of a pound, 2/10 of a pound. If you're normally 1/10 of a pound, maybe 2/10 of a pound might be good to go in this early season to get it going. Now, we've learned from Doug Soldat's work and Bill's work at Wisconsin that traffic reduces growth. When you have traffic, you're not getting as much top growth, right? That is having a big impact on it. Now, the last part of this, Carl, is green speed. So you get traffic and you want fast greens. Scott Niven wrote this article in the Tee to Green, the Met Superintendent's Tee to Green, a couple of years ago, escalating green speeds. And Todd Quintno just wrote another article in the most recent version of the Tee to Green from an architect's perspective. He attended a conference out in New England with a bunch of architects and did some survey work. And first off, in the first article by Scott Niven, he was listing the medium speed in the metropolitan New York area based on a survey was 11 feet 3 inches. A slow green was about 10 feet, 9 feet 9 inches, and a fast green was considered 12 feet 6 inches based on a survey of the metropolitan superintendents. Now, just a reminder, Scott Mingay, one of the research managers at the USGA involved with the development of the GS3, they did a GPS study a while ago looking at various green speeds and the actual amount of time that it took to play. So when you start getting above 10.5 feet on green speeds, you're looking at about 25 to 30 minute increases in the time it takes to play around the golf, or at least 2 minutes per putting surface based on the how the time it takes to play play around the golf. Now, my question is the stress worth it all the time, right? So that survey that Todd Quitno did asked a bunch of architects, when you're designing a green complex, how do you prioritize the following elements of green design? And they asked them to select the top 5. The first 2 by far were pinnable area and drainage functional performance. The next one was blending into surroundings. The next one was size and area and puttability, likely green speed. So it looks like pinnable area and drainage, 2 things we care about, are on architects' minds. Asking those architects for ideal green speed, at least 52% of them said 10 to 11 feet. An interesting full third said 9 to 10 feet. Now you take this in contrast with what superintendents say, and you begin to get at the root of some of this problem. And this is really going to drive everybody crazy. Who drives the bus on green speeds? When you asked architects, they threw the superintendents right under the bus. 44% of the architects said golf course superintendents are driving green speeds, and followed closely by green committees at 38%, right? At 38%. And then the golfers themselves or governing bodies are less than 10%. So you can see the big impact that design is having. Now, Carl, as I wrap it up, here's another little piece from Todd's article. Easy Locator has the ability to determine pinnable areas based on the size of your putting surface, the slope of the green, and the speed of the green. So here's a little exercise where they looked at the same putting surface at 3 different green speeds. At 7 feet green speed, which is presumably really low, 75% of that putting surface is available for pins, for cup locations. As soon as you go to 10 feet, now you're down to 40%. And when you go to 12 feet, you've got essentially 3% of that putting surface left the cup. Now, Carl, what is the interesting thing that I know you will comment on here as we wrap it up, as we're over the time, go figure. We're by ourselves and we're over the time. You said and showed on our state park golf courses, when we have less area on the putting surface, that drives up our traffic rate. So green speed also increases focused traffic to the places where you can put the whole location. That was an interesting, like, whoa, that is a big deal. So I think as a golfer, I know you like fast greens, but this has to concern you a little bit.
Yeah, exactly what I was thinking about, Frank. We've done some organic matter sampling and some of the new OM 246 stuff in the top 2 centimeters. And we were finding that at a golf course, the bigger greens have more organic matter. That's because traffic is more spread out. And then you have smaller greens. You know, we mentioned Shenango State Park. Larry's got 1 green that is literally a 5th of the size of his other green. He's got the smallest green in all of the state park system and the largest green in all the state park system. And they have different organic matter rates because there's different traffic. And you look at those charts from Easy Locator, you know, when I lose 35% of my pinnable area, I'm effectively shrinking that green, and now I'm focusing all that traffic in those areas. So there's probably agronomic issues there. When I think of as a golfer, and I talk to setup people like the NYSGA, they would rather have some slower green speeds because they can utilize more of the putting surfaces like the architect intended, getting it closer to ridges and having some sloped putts that are at least manageable from a golfer's perspective instead of being stuff that's going to roll off the green. So you know, the green speed, that's sort of the danger of benchmarking, right, Frank, is when you get into green speeds and 11 is considered medium, man, 11 is fast green. And like you said, that's going to drive up pace of play pretty quickly for your average membership, I would think.
So very, very interesting start to the season with the starting and stopping and you know, buckets of grass, and now you're staring at it. And if you have, as we talked about last week, and just to wrap it up, stressed greens now, it's not going to get any better unless you make some adjustments. And I think the final point is, if you are growing, getting the sand in there is going to help with that early season anthracnose as well. Now, if you're not growing, all you're doing is throwing the sand on top and you set your mower wrong, you're going to pick most of it up. So that's the lesson for today. It looks like we're going to need a little more patience moving forward, Carl.
Yeah, and so tomorrow we'll have Matt Elmore on from Rutgers, and we'll talk to Matt about, hey, lead development. Where is it at this year with this sort of stop and start weather we've had in the Northeast? So we're looking forward to that. We'll probably chat some crabgrass tomorrow. So everybody, we'll see you tomorrow for episode 12. For now, take care. Have a good one.
Take care. Thanks, Carl.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.